The Boys drops on Prime Video, and within the first 5 minutes, it does something that makes your stomach drop.
Besmirch Billy.
A superhero runs straight through a woman. She explodes, blood on his face, and he doesn't stop. That's the show's opening statement. These are not your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. And it keeps going. Later that season, another hero uses his invisibility to watch women in bathrooms. The boys kill him by shoving a bomb up his ass.
Get the back in that cage. Just take it easy, okay?
A few episodes after that, Homelander, the Superman analog, lets a plane full of people crash just because saving them would be inconvenient. This is the show everyone was talking about in 2019. A breath of grimy, dirty air. But was it actually new? Before we start, spoiler warning, I'm going to be talking about the following, both the movies, shows, and the comics of these series: The Boys, Invincible, Watchmen, The Dark Knight Returns, and the MCU, and a few obscure comics from the 1970s that you probably never heard of. If you haven't seen or read these and want to go in completely blind, save this video for later. It'll still be around. Also, if you enjoy this, hit that like button and subscribe. I make essays about comics, movies, TV shows, actual plays, tabletop role-playing games, and dig way too deep into all your favorite series. Now let's get into it. What superheroes would actually be like, grounded in a recognizable, cynical reality. The antidote to a decade of sanitized heroism. What happens when the people who are supposed to save the world are the ones you need saving from? And it didn't exactly stop. We are now in season 5, and we're still seeing no shortage of depraved, hypocritical, and downright diabolical acts from the heroes in the show. Some of these even coming from the very protagonists we've been made to root for throughout most of the show's runtime. Say what you want about the quality of the show now, but back in the beginning, I remember thinking the reactions to the show were comparable to early reactions of Game of Thrones or Attack on Titan, which, no matter how you might feel now about the endings, were really talked about in terms of elevating their specific genres, fantasy and anime, separating them apart as something new and refreshing and special. To me, mostly because these shows refuse to pull their punches. Everyone said the same thing. Finally, someone was telling the truth about superheroes. Finally, dark and gritty and real. The line, the antidote to a decade of sanitized heroism, is particularly interesting to me because I think it does really well in capturing the energy of that time. And I definitely think this is a bit of a dig at the MCU, which, arguable, if that's even fair. Tony Stark wasn't exactly a Boy Scout after all. And Infinity War ended with half of all life being erased and the heroes losing. But the feeling was real. After a decade of quippy, brightly lit, PG-13 blockbusters dominating the conversation, The Boys landed like a punch to the gut. Part 1, 2019, the reaction. Let's take the praise seriously for a second, because the critics weren't wrong about the feeling. Emily Todd Vanderwerf at Vox wrote that the real villain isn't Homelander, it's Vought International. Quote, the ceaseless working giant of corporate synergy, profit-sharing deals, and the PR spin. She called it a horror story about capitalism. And she was right. That was new. Previous dark superhero stories were afraid of nuclear war or urban decay or psychological trauma. The Boys is afraid of branding, of synergy, of the algorithm. But the method, the cynical, broken, morally bankrupt hero, that part wasn't new. So let's go back to the place everyone points to first. This idea that superheroes would actually be broken, corrupt, maybe even evil. I want to unpack it a little bit, and to do that, we need to first go back to 1986. Part 2, 1986, The Usual Suspects. When I got my university degree, I majored in psychology, but I also got a minor in English literature. One of the courses I took was about superheroes, and it wasn't necessarily where I was introduced to certain work, but it was where I read a lot of the classic superhero comics for the first time. One of which, from 1986, was Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns. You might know it as the one where Batman fights Superman at the end, but for the purposes of this essay, I want to talk about what Miller did to the character of Batman. Before 1986, Batman was largely campy. We had the TV show adaptation of Adam West. We had utility belts. We had pows and zaps. Miller took that and said, what if this guy was a depressed, middle-aged fascist? Academic Elliot Borenstein writes, Miller redefines Batman not as a hero, but as a paranoid product of the 80s preoccupation with urban crime and government overreach. He is a broken man who mistakes his trauma for moral certainty. And then Alan Moore's Watchmen, also 1986. Jeff Klock, in his academic study of deconstruction, called it the exemplary text for questioning the superhero concept itself. It breaks the genre down into its constituent parts, power, morality, trauma, and shows that none of them hold together under scrutiny. Moore takes a god, Dr. Manhattan, and makes him bored. He takes a patriot, the comedian, and makes him a rapist. He takes a detective, Rorschach, and makes him a fascist. If this sounds similar to things that occur in The Boys, that's exactly my point. The Boys isn't exactly breaking new ground, but this doesn't exactly disprove the decade of sanitized heroism claim either. So we have The Watchmen and The Dark Knight Returns. The origin of the cynical superhero. Case closed. Part 3. The Marvel Revolution and the Bronze Age. So we've got Watchmen and The Dark Knight Returns in 1986. That's the big bang of cynical deconstruction. But the story doesn't start there. It goes back further. Let me take you to the early 1960s. DC Comics was the king of the industry. Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, they were icons. Square-jawed, uncomplicated, they saved the day, made a quip, and flew off into the sunset. Stan Lee, who was just a writer at the time, thought that was boring. He said DC's heroes always won at the end, and they were brilliant and superior to the villains and never did anything wrong. So when his publisher told him to create a team to compete with DC's Justice League, he decided to do something different. Instead of perfect heroes who always got along, he created the Fantastic Four, a team that bickered, made mistakes, and didn't always win. The Thing was insecure about his appearance, Mr. Fantastic could be arrogant, the Human Torch was reckless. This was the Marvel Revolution, the idea that superheroes could be flawed, relatable, messy. His wife, Joan, actually pushed him to do it. He was thinking about quitting comics because he was bored. She told him, write one book the way you would like to do it. The worst that can happen is they fire you and you want to quit anyway. So he did. Lee later explained his philosophy. I tried to write different types of dialogue for each character, and I tried to merge the fantasy element with as much realism as I could put into the stories. That meant giving Peter Parker acne and money problems and guilt. It meant making Tony Stark an alcoholic. Although the comics didn't get there until later, it meant letting heroes fail. This wasn't yet deconstruction. It wasn't cynicism. Lee wasn't asking what if the hero is the villain, he was asking what if the hero has real problems. The Marvel heroes were flawed, they made mistakes, they had bad days. Peter Parker was selfish sometimes, Tony Stark was arrogant, the Thing hated himself, but they weren't secretly evil, at least not in this era. The story never asked if they deserved to be heroes. It just said heroes can be messy. Heroes can fail. Heroes can have allergies and guilt and bad luck. Compare that to Deconstruction. Rorschach isn't just flawed, he's a fascist. Homelander isn't arrogant, he's a monster. Marvel asked, what if heroes were human? Deconstruction asked, what if heroes were the problem? So why am I talking about this if it's not Deconstruction? Because it's the pre-cruiser. The Marvel Revolution made it okay for heroes to be imperfect. It cracked the door open. The Bronze Age, the 1970s, pushed that door further. Darker stories, real consequences. 1971, Green Arrow's sidekick Speedy gets addicted to heroin. The cover literally screams, Green Arrow, your young friend is a junkie. 1973, Spider-Man fails. Gwen Stacy dies. That never happened before. The hero was supposed to save the day, and he didn't. And then we come to the Punisher, a character whose entire premise is, what if a superhero just executes criminals? He debuts in 1974 in Amazing Spider-Man number 129. That's 12 years before Watchmen. Here's what Jackson Aries argues in the LA Review of Books. The relevance era of the early 1970s had already introduced drugs, racism, and urban decay into the four-color worlds. Miller and Moores didn't invent darkness, they just redefined it. So here's the full timeline so far. 1960s, the Marvel Revolution, flawed, relatable heroes, response to DC's perfect icons. 1970s, the Bronze Age, darker stories, drugs, death, the Punisher. 1982 to 1989, the proto-deconstruction, Alan Moore's Miracle Man, a superhero so broken he remakes reality. 1986, the Big Bang, Watchmen, The Dark Knight Returns, systematic takedowns of the genre itself. Late 1980s and early 1990s, the punk phase, martial law, hostile, satirical, sometimes just mean. Mid-1990s, the reaction, new sincerity. We'll come back to this. And 2019, the remix, The Boys TV show. The through line is the Marvel Revolution made heroes human, the Bronze Age made them dark, and Deconstruction made them cynical. 3 different eras, 3 different questions, 3 different answers. Now, before we go any further, we need to talk about the disaster, the cautionary tale, the bad Batman. All-Star Batman and Robin, the Boy Wonder. All-Star Batman and Robin, the Boy Wonder, published by DC Comics starting in 2005. The concept was simple. DC wanted to compete with Marvel's successful Ultimate Universe, so they launched an All-Star line. Pair the biggest names in comics with DC's most iconic characters, and give them complete creative freedom. The lineup really was a dream at the time. Grant Morrison and Frank Quitely on All-Star Superman, which became universally acclaimed, award-winning, and considered one of the greatest Superman comics of all time. And Frank Miller and Jim Lee on All-Star Batman and Robin, the Boy Wonder. Frank Miller, you remember him, right? The man who wrote The Dark Knight Returns and Batman Year One. He and Alan Moore have come up a few times in the script. Paired with Jim Lee, arguably the most popular artist of the era, it was supposed to be the ultimate Batman comic. Instead, it became infamous as the worst Batman comic ever written. Let me give you a sense of what this Batman is like. He's not dark and brooding. He's not tortured. He's a sociopathic, abusive, gleefully violent lunatic. More like Homelander than any recognizable version of Batman. After his parents are murdered, Bruce kidnaps 12-year-old Dick Grayson from the police station, drives him to the Batcave, and locks him in a dark room. When Dick asks who he is, Batman responds, "Are you dense? Are you the R slur or something? Who the hell do you think you're talking to? I'm the goddamn Batman." This is the actual text of a comic book written by Frank Miller and drawn by Jim Lee in 2005. Instead of comforting a traumatized child who just watched his parents get murdered, you know, the thing that defines Batman's entire psychology, Miller's Batman berates Dick, calls him slurs, and locks him in the Batcave with no food. He tells Alfred not to feed the boy. When Alfred sneaks him a cheeseburger anyway, Batman pins the elderly butler against the wall and screams at him. One critic described this version of Batman as practically a teenager in Batman's body, reveling in power without any of the responsibility or trauma that usually grounds the character. Then there's the Green Lantern incident. He has Robin paint an entire room yellow, which Hal Jordan is famously weak against. Robin almost ends up killing the Green Lantern, and then Batman beats up Robin. It's elaborate, it's petty, and it's completely insane. And then, keep in mind, this is real. Batman has sex with Black Canary on a filthy pier while the bodies of criminals burn behind them. This is presented as cool. The Encyclopedia Britannica notes that the book was perhaps his most divisive work yet, with readers left wondering whether the violent take on the Caped Crusader was intended as parody. One fan wiki puts it more bluntly. This version of Batman is an unforgivable adaptation of the character. Everything he was loved for was turned upside down in favor of a sadistic, abusive thug. But here's the thing. Most scholars and critics who looked at Miller's later work, Holy Terror, The Dark Knight Strikes Again, his later interviews, have concluded he was playing it straight. He wasn't winking, he wasn't deconstructing, he just wrote a bad Batman. The Washington Times called this version of Batman more like a sadistic thug from Sin City than the world's greatest detective. The comic was never finished. It was abandoned after 10 issues over 3 years due to constant delays. But the planned ending, the one Miller allegedly had in mind, apparently Batman's abuse of Dick Grayson was supposed to create the Joker, the implication being Batman's own cruelty turns an innocent boy into the clown prince of crime. So the thesis of All-Star Batman and Robin, if it had one, was that Batman is the real villain, not because of systematic corruption or complicated morality, because he's mean to a kid. So why am I spending all this time on a famously bad comic? Because All-Star Batman and Robin is the cautionary tale. It's what happens when dark and gritty loses its purpose, when cynicism isn't saying anything, it's just there. To be edgy, for shock value. In 1980s deconstruction, Watchmen, The Dark Knight Returns, they had something to say. They were responding to Cold War anxiety, urban decay, the nature of power. All-Star Batman and Robin has nothing to say. It's just cruel, and it's not even fun cruel. It's an exhausting read. It's the bad version of what The Boys could have been if it went down an even more edgy, gritty, and more hopeless route. And it's the perfect bridge between 1986 and 2019. Part 5. The Other Amazon Superman. Now let's talk about the other show. Let's talk about... I hope people got that joke because they do the thing with the title card. Anyway. Also Amazon Prime, debuting in 2021, running concurrently with The Boys, also features a Superman analog who turns out to be a monster. In fact, Invincible did something The Boys couldn't do. It hid the twist until the end of the first episode. For 37 minutes, if you didn't read the comics or know anything about it, you'd think you're watching a standard coming-of-age superhero cartoon. Bright colors, teenage angst, a boy learning to fly. And then Omniman, the hero's father, voiced by J.K. Simmons, murders the world's entire Justice League parody in a 10-minute bloodbath that ends with the immortal's severed head. On paper, Omniman and Homelander are the same archetype. Both are evil Superman analogs. Both are the strongest, most beloved heroes on Earth. Both secretly despise humans and commit atrocities. Both have half-human children. But here's where they diverge. Omniman's violence is strategic. He kills the Guardians because they're an obstacle to Viltrumite conquest. He's cruel, yes, but he has a goal. Homelander's violence is therapeutic. He kills because he's bored, angry, annoyed, because someone looked at him wrong, because he can. Robert Kirkman, who created Invincible, said this about his approach. Invincible is very much a story that presents itself as one thing and then slowly reveals itself to be something else. It doesn't strive to say that we're elevated from the superhero genre or that we're somehow better than other superhero stories. Darren Mooney at The Escapist argued that Invincible doesn't deconstruct superhero tropes, it celebrates them. Underneath that brutality, it's a standard superhero setup. That's a key difference. The Boys takes superheroes and says they would be monsters. Invincible takes superheroes and says even the monsters might have a reason, even the monsters might change. Because here's another thing that Invincible does that the Boys comics never dared with Homelander. Omni-Man gets a redemption arc. One critic describes it this way: Omni-Man finds genuine love and raises a son, having seemingly cast aside his genocidal impulses to become a good man. What do you do when the monster in your own life has changed? Homelander becomes worse over time, more unhinged, more violent, more alone. Omni-Man becomes better, not perfect, not necessarily forgiven, but different. He starts questioning the Viltrumite Empire. He betrays his own people. He dies, in the comics, protecting Earth. Kirkman has discussed this directly with The Boys producers Seth Rogen and Evan Goldberg. Their conclusion: Omni-Man would easily trash Homelander in a fight. But more importantly, Kirkland said Homelander is significantly less powerful than Omni-Man, but also less interesting. Homelander is a victim of his own power. Omni-Man is a victim of his own choices. And he gets to make different ones. So here's how I'd frame it for the argument I'm building. The Boys has a cynical, satirical, angry tone, while Invincible has a tone that's sincere, violent, hopeful underneath. The Boys has an evil Superman in Homelander, irredeemable, broken, tragic, while Invincible has Omni-Man, redeemable, conflicted, changing. The Boys has a hero in Huey, who preserves hope, and Invincible has a hero in Mark, who becomes better than his father. The Boys has a core question that asks, what if power corrupts absolutely? And Invincible's core question asks, what if power can be reclaimed? Both shows are responding to the same tradition. Watchmen, Dark Knight Returns, The Punisher, both are using the evil Superman trope to ask questions about power. But The Boys answers power is corruption, the system is broken, hope is resistance. Invincible answers power can be redirected, people can change, family is worth fighting for. And here's the thing, I think both answers are sincere. Neither is ironic, neither is winking at you. That's the thread connecting all of this, not the darkness, the sincerity. Part 6, the comics versus the show, where things get weird. Garth Ennis's original comic of The Boys is pretty rough. That's not just me saying it. One review calls it Edgelord Provocation, a comic where infanticide and cannibalism are reportedly rolled into a single act of graphic shock value. Ennis doubled down on lurid content because that's what had worked for him before. The result, a comic that's less interested in saying something than in shocking you. I refer you back to All-Star Batman and Robin. Even Ennis himself has admitted regrets, specifically about his female characters. Quote, I think I did a disservice to some of them. I was so focused on the satire that I forgot to make them people. So Ennis wrote a pure deconstruction, a brutal, mean-spirited, sometimes brilliant deconstruction of superheroes. Then Eric Kripe and his writers came along to adapt it, and they made a bunch of changes, small ones at first, then bigger ones. And those changes, they tell a different story. Let me show you what I mean. Take A-Train. In the comic, he's unrepentant. He feels zero guilt about killing Robin. He dies by Huey's hand, and you feel nothing because the comic gave you nothing to feel. One breakdown notes that comic A-Train is a self-obsessed man-child until the very end. In the show, by season 4, he's defected to the Boys. And in the season 5 premiere, he dies saving Huey, deliberately swerving to avoid running through another innocent woman. His last act is laughing in Homelander's face. A-Train's redemption is complete. He doesn't just die. He chooses to die protecting the man whose girlfriend he killed and deliberately choosing not to make the same mistake he made at the start of the series. He chooses to change, to have the redemption and be the true hero Homelander never would be. Okay, I also want to talk about Queen Maeve because she's my favorite. And let me describe comic Maeve for you. She's a cold and jaded alcoholic who mostly barks orders at her groveling servant, normally for another martini. She sleeps with countless male heroes. And in the end, she gets decapitated by Homelander while trying to protect Starlight. Now show Maeve. One review puts it bluntly: "It's safe to say that The Boys improved Maeve's character in almost every way." Let me count the ways. 1. Show Maeve is explicitly bisexual. She has a girlfriend, Elena, in the comic that's not present. The show's version of Vought cynically markets her as a proud lesbian for PR purposes, but she is a real person with real love. 2. Show Maeve is conflicted, not cold. She drinks because she's traumatized, specifically by Flight 37, the plane crash where Homelander forced her to abandon innocent people. She carries that guilt for 3 seasons. A 2022 analysis piece describes her arc as slowly gaining the courage to break away from a toxic environment, reclaim her strength and identity, finding hope at rock bottom. Then it adds, "This is an incredibly complex story that hasn't been explored at this magnitude in the comic book subgenre." The show added depth. It invented interiority where the comic had empty space. 3. Her friendship with Starlight. In the comic, they barely bond. In the show, Starlight calls her out. Maeve listens. She saves Starlight's life. She encourages her. Keep being good because one of us has to. Showing mentorship over nihilism. 4. Her ending. In the comic, Maeve dies brutally. In the show, she loses her powers, pushing Soldier Boy out a window, and survives. She reunites with Elena. She gets to live. I'll make this one fast. In the comic, Kimiko doesn't have a name. She's just called the female of the species. She exists for fight scenes. That's it. In the show, she has a name, a backstory, a brother, a voice. Literally, she learns to sign and eventually talk. By season 5, she's one of the most emotionally complex characters on the show. And finally, Butcher. In the comic, he's an unstoppable beast, pure vengeance, a force of nature with no off switch. In the show, he's a mess. He makes mistakes, he hurts the people he loves, he kills the majority of the boys, and in season 5, there's a shot of him just holding his dog, hinting maybe all hope isn't lost, even for Billy Butcher. So here's what I started to realize. The comic is pure deconstruction. It takes the idea of a superhero and says, what if they were all horrible? What if nothing mattered? The show takes that same premise and says something different. Part 7, the reveal. This isn't cynicism. Here's my argument. The show actually isn't saying, what if superheroes were all horrible? It's saying, what if they were complicated? What if some of them tried to be better? What if failing and trying again was the point? Deconstruction and then reconstruction. And there's a name for this. It's called New Sincerity. Rafael Alves Vito defines New Sincerity as a post-ironic movement that emerged in the mid-1990s. It was a direct reaction to the cynicism of Watchmen and The Dark Knight Returns. It has 3 key traits. 1, rejection of ironic detachment, moving away from the nothing matters pose. 2, emotional sincerity, allowing characters to genuinely care, even in absurd contexts. 3, hope as a conscious choice. Not naive optimism, but hope chosen despite knowing the darkness. In the 1990s, writers like Grant Morrison and Kurt Busiek got tired of the gloom. Morrison's Justice League of America brought back the idea that heroes could be inspiring, not because they were simple, but because they chose to be. Busiek's Astro City went even further. He wrote an entire arc called The Dark Age, explicitly to come to terms with the effect that Moore and Miller have had on comics. His argument, hope survives, even flawed heroes can strive for something better. And I really think The Boys TV show is doing the same thing, just with more exploding heads. Part 8, polished versus barbed wire. We talked about some differences between Invincible and The Boys TV show, and you're also probably thinking, wait a second, what about the MCU? Isn't that the literal definition of superhero sincerity? And you're right. Sometimes. I don't think that the MCU has never done anything sincere or complex. The Winter Soldier is a paranoid spy thriller about government surveillance. It plays it completely straight. No jokes undercutting the tension. It's great. WandaVision let a woman sit in her grief for 9 episodes. It was weird, it was messy, and it didn't apologize for being uncomfortable. Agatha all along did the same thing. It took a villain and said, let's actually sit with her and see why she's like this. And they didn't say, oh, actually, she's not a villain, though. Those are hits. They earned their sincerity. But here's the thing, for every Winter Soldier, there's a movie that's terrified of its own emotions. Thor Ragnarok is widely considered a blast. I enjoyed watching it. It's a really fun, funny movie. It's also a movie where Thor's entire homeland is gone. His father is dead. His sister just tried to kill him. Most of his friends have died. And this is continuously undercut by jokes. It's funny, but it also says, don't worry, audience, we aren't actually going to make you feel sad. And then Love and Thunder took that impulse and ran it into the ground. Jane Foster is dying of cancer. Thor is grieving. The movie keeps undercutting every sincere beat with a gag. It's like it's allergic to its own emotions. That's polished sincerity at its worst. Not because the emotions are fake. Jane's death is genuinely sad on paper, but because the movie won't let you sit in it. It's too afraid of making the audience uncomfortable. So when I talk about polished sincerity, I don't mean the MCU is incapable of being real. I mean the machine around it, the franchise, the brand, the expectation often smooths over the rough edges. It sandblasts the vulnerability until all that's left is a product that makes you feel good but not challenged. The Boys does something different. I like to call what The Boys does barbed wire sincerity. It's anything but smooth. It's all rough edges, sometimes at its own deterrent. It's wrapped in gore and irony and absolute filth, and it can be uncomfortable to look at. In the MCU, redemption is a shining moment on a battlefield. In The Boys, redemption is A-Train, a man who has done truly unforgivable things, dying in the dirt to save one person. Not because it's heroic, but because he finally, sincerely, just couldn't be that other guy anymore. When Huey chooses hope, he's doing it in a world where hope is actively mocked. When Maeve walks away to live a quiet life with Elena, she isn't getting a parade, she's getting out of her life and a lot of trauma. And Maeve doesn't return to the story in a let's bring a beloved character back for the fans moment. Her story's done there. The MCU's, even at its best, is a product. It has to work for the brand. The Boys' sincerity is a risk. It hits harder because the show spent 3 seasons convincing you that everyone is a monster. When they finally show you a human heart, it feels like it was earned in the trenches, the entirety of the series. So let's look at the full picture, because the decade of sanitized heroism, the one The Ringer was talking about, was never the only story. 2003, The Elseworld. Superman, Red Sun, a dark Superman who isn't evil, just misguided, a dictator who thinks he's helping. This came out the same year as Daredevil and X2. The MCU hasn't even started yet. 2005 to 2008, Deconstruction Gone Wrong, All-Star Batman and Robin, Cynicism Without a Purpose, The Cautionary Tale, running at the same time as Batman Begins and Iron Man. 2003, the video game Injustice Gods Among Us, Superman becomes a fascist dictator after trauma. This came out the same year as Iron Man 3 and Thor: The Dark World. Alternate timeline, no permanent damage to the main Superman. 2007, The Dark Multiverse, The Batman Who Laughs, Batman's trauma consumes him completely. Same year as Justice League and Thor Ragnarok, alternate timeline again. 2009, the remix, The Boys TV show, arrives looking like Cynicism. Everyone calls it dark and gritty. 2002, the other Amazon show, Invincible, an evil Superman analog, but one who gets a redemption arc, sincere, hopeful, underneath the violence. 2021, The Vampire King, DC vs. Vampires. Nightwing, the most hopeful hero in DC canon, becomes a monster, another alternate timeline. So when critics called The Boys the antidote to a decade of sanitized heroism, they weren't completely wrong about the feeling. The MCU was dominant, the quippy, brightly lit, PG-13 blockbuster was the template. But dark superhero stories never went away. They were just happening in other sandboxes. Elseworlds, alternate timelines, video games, and sometimes, like with All-Star Batman and Robin, they were happening badly. The Boys didn't invent darkness, it just brought it to Prime Video, with no alternate timeline to fall back on. Not the darkness, the sincerity. So let me circle back to where we started. In 2019, everyone praised The Boys for being dark and gritty and realistic, and they weren't lying about the feeling. The show is dark, it's gory, it's cynical on its surface, but that's not what it is. That's just its aesthetic. What it is, what it's actually doing, is something else entirely. The dark, gritty, realistic superhero is not new. That's Watchmen, that's Dark Knight Returns, that's Punisher, all the way back in 1974. That's 40 years of comic book history from the Bronze Age to the edgelord 2000s. Genre switches back and forth. Audiences get tired of one mood and want the opposite. Light and campy get old, so people want dark and edgy. Dark and edgy gets exhausting, so people want something lighter. Batman started out carrying a gun, then he was dancing the Badusi, then he got broody again. That's a pattern. But every time the genre swings, the good stories, the ones worth your time, they find something new to say. Watchmen asked questions nobody had asked, but The Boys TV show isn't Watchmen. It's not trying to be. Watchmen asked who watches The Watchmen. It's a question about power and corruption and the impossibility of accountability. The Boys TV show asks a different question. It asks, what if the Watchmen tried to be better and failed and tried again? A-Train dies saving Huey. Maeve walks away to peace. Kimiko finds her voice. Huey refuses to stop believing. And even Butcher, with his heel face turned, much to the chagrin of many Redditors, has his story softened. He doesn't kill any of the boys, and he dies being comforted and comforting one of his closest friends. Eric Kripe, when talking about Maeve's exit and reflecting on the Bury Your Gays trope, said, "The Boys is a moral universe, and when you make the right choices, you get rewarded." I mean, A-Train is still dead, but he seems pretty happy in the end there, despite everything. More seriously, he also got to be a hero, something Homelander will never truly be. Deconstruction and then reconstruction. New sincerity. The conversation moving past cynicism by acknowledging the darkness, but choosing to believe in something anyway. I'm not going to stand here and say the finale is perfect. I've read the criticism. People wanted a bigger Homelander death. They wanted the scorched earth payoff that the comic delivered. They wanted Butcher to go full monster or full hero, not this messy middle ground. And honestly, I think a lot of that criticism is probably fair. The pacing is weird. Some arcs do feel rushed. But I keep coming back to the stories that have the most meaning to myself. Homelander dies begging, not in a blaze of glory, just pathetic, afraid, begging for mercy on TV television as Butcher drives a crowbar through his skull. The ending of a sad, broken person who never had a chance. The Deep gets one last chance. Starlight, the woman he assaulted in the very first episode, looks him in the eye and asks him to take some fucking accountability. He refuses, screams no, and then the marine life he spent his whole career ignoring turns on him. Butcher has his heel turn. He wants to release a virus that would kill every soup on the planet. Huey tracks him down, they fight. Huey mortally wounds him, says sorry, says he's calling an ambulance. Butcher stops and says it had to be done because he wasn't going to stop. Huey doesn't walk away cold. In Butcher's final moments, they comfort each other. He stays, he mourns. Later at Butcher's grave, he says, love him or hate him, he made the world a safer place, which makes him a hero. And most of the people we care about, Huey, Starlight, Mother's Milk, Kimiko, Ryan, they survive. They get happy endings. Messy and complicated, but still happy. Huey and Annie are having a baby. They're naming her Robin, after the woman whose death started all of this. Frenchie dies, and he and Kimiko don't get to end the series together. That's the bitter in the bittersweet. People who wanted a clean, epic, scorched earth ending, I get why they're disappointed. After the comic's nihilism, a lot of fans expected the show to go full scorched earth, but the show was never actually that cynical. It just looked like it. The finale is messy, it's inconsistent. Some characters get redemption, some don't. Some get happy endings, some die. I saw a Reddit thread after the finale where someone said they were watching the last moment completely anxious. They thought a new speedster was going to run right through Huey. They were bracing for an explosion. Another person replied, imagine if they had the balls to do it. The dark ending, the pessimistic ending. I think it gets it backwards. The show spent 5 seasons training us to expect the worst, to assume the cruel punchline, and then at the last moment, it didn't. In some ways, that's harder to pull off than the downer ending. Still not a perfect ending. Dan Edgar has returned to Vought. In some ways, the cycle does keep going. Starlight heads off to a fight. There's clearly still a battle to be waged, but the characters have earned their moment of peace. And I think having that balance feels more honest to me. If you made it this far, thank you. Seriously, hit that like button if you learned something, and subscribe if you want more essays about comics, movies, why your favorite show is maybe doing something smarter than you think. Also, go read Watchmen, then go watch The Boys. Watch Invincible. I feel like the ending of The Boys is definitely polarizing, so I'm curious what you think about that. Punk hope is truly what's radical these days. Stay safe, stay weird, and keep a lookout for my next video, which is gonna explore what came before this whole area. The Golden Age, the Comics Code, how Batman went from carrying a gun to dancing the Badusi. I'm making a whole video about that, so stay tuned. Bye!